Claire Holloway, a single mother searching for a fresh start in Los Angeles, and Dr. Thomas Sinclair, a respected married doctor with a family, had no idea that their secret affair would lead them down a deadly path. What began as a forbidden romance, fueled by desire and hidden behind closed doors, soon spiraled into a tragic and violent confrontation, ending in double murder. Their story, filled with betrayal, obsession, and heartbreak, would leave a city reeling and their lives forever destroyed. For the first time, Los Angeles, a city of dreams and disappointments, was where Claire Holloway sought to rebuild her life. A single mother in her late 30s, Claire had recently left behind a small town in the Midwest, escaping a failed marriage and the suffocating weight of old memories. She moved to LA with her 12-year-old son, Noah, in search of a fresh start, hoping the vastness of the city would offer them both a new beginning. The sprawling streets, filled with people from all walks of life, seemed to promise opportunity, though Claire couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she might be running away from something instead of running toward anything. Claire was intelligent and independent, qualities that had helped her survive through tough times. But when she arrived in LA, the loneliness began to settle in. As a new mother trying to find her place in an unfamiliar city, she often felt like an outsider. Though she had a few acquaintances, making close friends seemed almost impossible in a city where everyone was too busy to notice. Her son, Noah, had his own struggles, adjusting to a new school and trying to make sense of the new life Claire had thrust upon him. Yet, despite the challenges, she kept her head up, determined to make it work. Claire eventually found work as a nurse at a large hospital in the heart of the city. She was competent, hard-working, and immediately respected by her colleagues. Still, she never allowed herself to get too comfortable. There were always whispers about staff turnover, office politics, and the occasional rumor about the doctors. But Claire was focused on her job, trying to build a stable life for Noah. Her days were long and exhausting, but they gave her a sense of purpose that she had sorely lacked since leaving her old life behind. It was during one of her late shifts at the hospital that she first met Dr. Thomas Sinclair. He was a respected physician in his mid-40s, known for his brilliance and charm. Married with 2 children and a high-profile career, Thomas was the kind of man who seemed to have it all. But there was something in his eyes, an emptiness, that Claire couldn't ignore. They first exchanged a few casual words during a lunch break in the hospital's cafeteria. Claire had noticed him before, walking through the halls with his air of authority, but it was during that brief encounter that their connection began. Over time, their interactions grew more personal. At first, it was small talk. How was her day going? How was Noah adjusting to his new life? But as the weeks passed, they found themselves speaking more and more, sharing bits of their lives, their frustrations, their hopes. For Claire, it was a welcome distraction from the mundane routine of daily life. She had been so consumed with raising Noah and making ends meet that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. Thomas listened intently, his blue eyes fixed on her as if he understood the weight she carried. For Thomas, it was different. His marriage to Marianne had been in trouble for years. What began as a passionate love story had deteriorated into a partnership of convenience. Marianne, his wife, was distant, and their once strong bond had been replaced with resentment and silence. His career kept him busy, but it was clear to anyone who observed him that he was unhappy. Claire, with her kind smile and genuine interest, became an escape, an opportunity to feel alive again. But neither of them realized at the time just how dangerous that escape would become. As their friendship deepened, The lines between professional and personal began to blur. They exchanged private texts, shared more intimate details, and met outside the hospital under the guise of casual friendship. There was something thrilling about the secrecy of it all, a rush that both Claire and Thomas were drawn to. But in the back of their minds, they knew the inevitable. One way or another, this secret would come to light, and when it did, everything would change. As the weeks turned into months, the connection between Claire and Thomas grew deeper, and their secret affair became an ever-present force in their lives. What started as innocent conversation over lunch or quick exchanges in the hospital corridors had now evolved into something much more. Late-night texts, stolen moments in empty hallways, and quiet meetings in secluded spots around Los Angeles. The thrill of their secret kept them both on edge, but there was also an undeniable attraction, one that neither of them had anticipated but both had fallen into with reckless abandon. For Claire, the affair was a lifeline. After years of feeling like she had sacrificed everything for her son, she had finally found someone who made her feel special, desired, and seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. The emotional weight of her failed marriage, the struggles of being a single mother, and the loneliness that haunted her every day began to lift when Thomas's attention was on her. He listened to her in ways that others hadn't, offering comfort and understanding in the midst of her exhaustion. The late-night phone calls, the messages, and their secret rendezvous gave her something to hold on to, a feeling of being desired and valued in a world that often left her invisible. But Thomas, too, was drawn to Claire in ways he hadn't anticipated. His marriage to Marianne had been in trouble for years. He had tried to hold it together to keep the peace, but the cracks had deepened over time. Marianne was no longer the woman he had fallen in love with. She had become distant, preoccupied with their children and her own life. The passion and connection they had once shared had withered away, replaced by a cold routine that neither of them seemed willing to break. In Claire, Thomas found an escape, an oasis from the dissatisfaction he felt in his marriage. She was a breath of fresh air, a reminder of the man he used to be, before the weight of responsibility and the pressure of family life had taken their toll. With Claire, he could laugh, he could be vulnerable, and he could feel alive again. Yet, despite their growing connection, both Claire and Thomas were aware of the dangers of their relationship. Thomas was married, with children who depended on him. Claire had a son, Noah, who was the center of her world. Neither of them wanted to tear apart their lives completely, but the emotional intensity of their affair made it hard to imagine a life without it. They began to make excuses to see each other more frequently, finding hidden corners of the hospital where they could talk, or even share brief stolen kisses. At the time, it felt like a game, an illicit thrill that both of them craved. However, as the affair deepened, the weight of secrecy began to take its toll. Claire started to feel the strain of hiding her emotions. She was falling for Thomas, and the longer they kept their relationship a secret, the more she felt like she was living a double life. The guilt, the lies, and the constant fear of being discovered wore on her. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if someone at the hospital might suspect something. Each stolen moment felt both exciting and terrifying, a fragile balance that threatened to crumble at any moment. Meanwhile, Thomas was facing his own internal conflict. Though he had promised to work on his marriage, he found himself drawn to Claire more and more. He would tell himself that he would stop, that he would end things for good, but every time they met, the connection between them felt too strong to ignore. He began to question his life, his marriage, his career, and the choices he had made. Claire had made him feel important again, something his marriage had long since stripped away. He didn't want to hurt Marianne, but with every passing day, he felt trapped in a web of his own making. The affair remained a tightly guarded secret, but outside of their hidden encounters, life continued as usual. Claire continued to work long hours at the hospital, raising Noah as best as she could, while Thomas juggled his demanding career with the coldness at home. Neither of them spoke openly about the future. There was no clear path forward, just the thrill of the present. But deep down, both Claire and Thomas knew that their secret affair could not last forever. Sooner or later, something would give. Neither of them could foresee how soon that something would come, and how it would shatter their lives in ways they never imagined. The Eurikian cruise accelerated from the ship as the attack began. As the months wore on, the affair between Claire and Thomas began to show cracks. What had initially felt like a thrilling escape from their respective lives now seemed more like a fragile tightrope, stretching thin with each passing day. Claire, once invigorated by the secrecy and excitement of their meetings, began to feel the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. She had fallen deeply in love with Thomas, and the reality of their situation started to hit her harder than she had anticipated. The late-night texts and stolen moments no longer satisfied her. She wanted more. She wanted him to leave his wife, to build a future together, to stop living in the shadows. But each time she voiced her feelings, Thomas would promise her that he needed more time. He was still working on his marriage, still trying to make things work with Marianne. The repeated promises without any clear action only deepened Claire's frustration. She had invested so much of herself into this relationship, but it felt as though she was the only one willing to give up anything significant. She had been patient, understanding of his responsibilities to his family, but as the weeks passed, the patience turned to resentment. She wanted to believe that Thomas would eventually choose her, that one day he would come to his senses and see her as the answer to his unhappiness. But with every passing day, Claire began to feel like the other woman in the story, always waiting, always hoping, never fully embraced. Thomas, on the other hand, found himself torn between the woman who gave him attention and understanding and the reality of his family life. His marriage to Marianne had long been devoid of passion, yet he had convinced himself for years that they could work through their problems. When he had met Claire, the spark he had been missing reignited, and he found himself wanting her more with each passing day, but he couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him. Marianne, for all her faults, was still his wife, and the thought of tearing apart his family was a decision he couldn't make lightly. He loved Claire, but the weight of his responsibilities seemed insurmountable. He told her over and over again that he would eventually leave Marianne, but each time he delayed that promise. It became even more a barren to him when he finally delayed that promise, and Dan still had. But what Thomas didn't realize was that Marianne had started to sense something was off. She wasn't blind to the changes in her husband's behavior. Thomas had become more distant, his late nights at the hospital increasingly frequent, and his attention had shifted in a way that she couldn't ignore. She had always trusted Thomas, perhaps too much. But now she found herself checking his phone, his emails, and even his calendar. Her suspicions grew with each passing day, until one evening, while Thomas was working late at the hospital, Marianne found the evidence she had been searching for. A series of text messages between Thomas and Claire, full of flirtation, longing, and promises of a future together. Marianne was devastated. Her suspicions were confirmed, and she was left reeling from the realization that her husband had been unfaithful for months. The shock of it hit her like a physical blow, and she knew that she couldn't just let it go. She confronted Thomas when he returned home that night, demanding an explanation. The confrontation was filled with anger, pain, and accusations. Thomas, caught in the web of his own lies, tried to downplay it, claiming that it was a mistake and that he would end it with Claire immediately. But Marianne wasn't interested in his apologies or promises. She had been betrayed, and the woman who had been a part of their family's life for so long now felt like a stranger. Thomas promised that he would end things with Claire and work on repairing his marriage, but deep down he knew he had already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The affair had become too much a part of him to easily walk away from. He tried to reassure Marianne, but the damage was done. She no longer trusted him, and their marriage, already fragile, was now shattered beyond repair. Despite his best efforts to hold on to both lives, Thomas realized he was losing both. The affair had taken on a life of its own, and the consequences of his actions were beginning to close in on him. Meanwhile, Claire's emotional turmoil was reaching a boiling point. She had never imagined that her love for Thomas would feel so painful. She had sacrificed so much for a relationship that seemed to be spiraling out of her control. She had given him everything, her heart, her trust, and her deepest hopes for a future together. But now she found herself questioning everything. Thomas had promised he would leave Marianne, but nothing had changed. Each passing day only increased her frustration and her desperation for him to finally choose her. The secrecy, the lies, and the emotional manipulation had begun to eat away at her. The dream of a future together seemed farther away than ever, and Claire's disillusionment began to fester into something darker. As the tension in their respective lives grew, neither Claire nor Thomas understood just how much their affair would eventually destroy. They had both underestimated the emotional cost of their choices, and the consequences of their actions were about to catch up with them in ways they couldn't have anticipated. What had started as a forbidden romance would soon spiral out of control, and the fallout would leave both of them with scars that would last a lifetime. The emotional strain of the affair had reached a breaking point. Claire's internal conflict had become overwhelming. What had once been a thrilling escape from her struggles as a single mother now felt like a suffocating cage. She had hoped that Thomas would eventually leave his wife, but weeks had turned into months, and he had not taken any concrete steps toward leaving Marianne. Claire had sacrificed so much of herself for this relationship, and yet each day that passed only reinforced the painful reality that she was not his priority. She was living in the shadows, a side character in a drama that Thomas seemed unable or unwilling to resolve. Every promise of a future together felt empty, and Claire could no longer ignore the fact that she was being strung along. He was being strung along. Thomas, too, was becoming increasingly torn. Despite his feelings for Claire, his guilt over betraying his family weighed heavily on him. He loved his children, and the thought of losing them, of destroying his family, haunted him. He promised Claire that he would leave Marianne, but each time they spoke about it, he found an excuse to delay. The pressure from both sides, his wife's accusations and Claire's growing dissatisfaction, was becoming unbearable. He felt trapped between two women, both of whom he had hurt deeply. The love he had for Claire was genuine, but the life he had built with Marianne and their children was something he couldn't easily walk away from. The weight of the decision was starting to crush him. It was during one of their increasingly tense meetings that Claire made a decision that would change everything. She could no longer bear the torment of waiting for Thomas to choose her, and the anger she felt toward him for not acting on his promises started to consume her. The hurt from months of emotional manipulation, The constant feeling of being the second choice pushed her to a dark place. She began to see Thomas not as the man who had once offered her comfort and affection, but as a symbol of her failure, of everything she had given and lost without receiving anything in return. Edward. One evening, Claire drove to the secluded beach where she and Thomas had met many times before, hoping to find some sense of closure. She had told herself it was the last time they would meet, that she would end things for good. But when Thomas arrived, his words sent her spiraling further into her emotional turmoil. He apologized again for not leaving Marianne, promising that it was just a matter of time before things would change. But Claire had heard it all before, and it felt like a lie. The anger bubbled up inside her, an uncontrollable force that clouded her judgment. This time, when Thomas told her that he needed to stay with his family a little longer, Claire snapped. The familiar sense of betrayal was too much to bear. In a moment of rage, Claire snapped. Her emotions, long suppressed, exploded in a violent rush. She didn't fully understand what she was doing as she grabbed a knife from her bag and turned toward him. She confronted Thomas, demanding to know why he couldn't just choose her, why he couldn't end the marriage that had clearly been over for so long. Thomas, confused and scared, tried to calm her down, but the words only seemed to fuel her anger. In her mind, he had chosen Marianne over her one too many times, and this was her chance to reclaim some of the control she had lost. The scene that unfolded on that beach was chaotic and terrifying. Claire, driven by a mix of hurt and desperation, attacked Thomas in a blind fury. The knife found its mark, and as he collapsed to the ground, his life slipping away, Claire stood over him, her mind racing but numb to the reality of what she had just done. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. For a brief moment, the anger faded, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. She had killed the man she had once loved, the man who had promised her a future that would never come. The aftermath of the murder was swift and unsettling. Claire, in a daze, fled the scene, leaving Thomas's lifeless body behind. Her mind was clouded, her actions driven by emotions that had long been suppressed. She returned to her apartment, but the weight of what had happened began to sink in. As the night wore on, Claire realized that she could never undo what she had done. The rage that had propelled her into that moment now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the grim reality of the consequences she would face. The next morning, the police arrived at the Sinclair household. Marianne was devastated to discover that her husband was dead, the victim of an apparent attack. As detectives pieced together the evidence, Claire's disappearance raised suspicions. The timeline of events, the affair, and the escalating tension between Thomas and Claire were all too evident. The investigation quickly focused on Claire, who had vanished into thin air. The police were closing in on her, and the truth was only a matter of time before it would all be exposed. What had begun as a passionate, forbidden romance had ended in an irreversible tragedy, one that would alter the lives of everyone involved forever. As the days passed following Thomas's death, the investigation into his murder quickly intensified. Detectives combed through his personal life, uncovering the affair with Claire Holloway. The affair, once a secret whispered only between Claire and Thomas, was now at the forefront of the investigation, and it didn't take long for the police to connect the dots. Claire's absence was the key piece of the puzzle. She had disappeared without a trace the night Thomas had been killed. With no alibi and her emotional instability and anger well documented, Claire became the prime suspect. Meanwhile, Claire was on the run, hiding in plain sight. The adrenaline from the night of the murder had worn off, leaving her with a deep sense of dread. She knew she had crossed a line that she could never uncross. The gravity of what she had done, the man she had loved, the life she had destroyed, began to settle over her like a suffocating weight. She tried to rationalize her actions, to tell herself that she had acted out of pure emotion, that it was Thomas's betrayal that had pushed her over the edge. But deep down, she knew she had lost control, and there was no going back. For days, Claire moved from place to place, changing her appearance and laying low in an attempt to avoid the inevitable. She was no longer the woman she had been before the affair, the woman who had come to Los Angeles in search of a fresh start. The city she had once hoped would give her a new life now felt like a trap. Everywhere she went, she feared the sirens, the flashing lights of the police closing in on her. But Claire didn't realize how close the authorities were to finding her. Detectives had already linked her to the crime scene. They had traced her movements from the hospital to the beach, where witnesses had seen her arguing with Thomas that night. The more they dug, the more they uncovered about her troubled emotions leading up to the murder. They spoke to Claire's co-workers, who described her as increasingly erratic, her frustration with Thomas palpable. Her growing obsession had not gone unnoticed, and the signs of her emotional turmoil were clear to anyone who had been paying attention. The affair had consumed her, and now, it seemed, it had consumed everything in its wake. It wasn't long before Claire's name was all over the news. The public fascination with the case skyrocketed. A woman scorned, a man caught between two lives, a murder born of jealousy and passion. The media painted Claire as a tragic figure, a woman who had fallen victim to her own emotions, her own fantasies of a life she could never have. But for Claire, the reality was far from the headlines. The public had no idea of the pain, the guilt, and the overwhelming sorrow that had followed her from that night. She was no longer just a woman who had been in love. She was a fugitive. Then, just as it seemed like Claire might slip away unnoticed, the authorities caught a break. A tip came in from a motel clerk who had seen Claire checking into a low-budget hotel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was enough to put the investigators on her trail. The police set up surveillance, waiting for the right moment to make an arrest. When Claire emerged from her room one morning, they were ready. The arrest was quick, and despite her attempts to run, Claire was taken into custody without incident. At first, Claire couldn't understand how she had been caught. The realization that her life had unraveled so completely, that the person she had once been was now gone, left her numb. She was transported to the police station, her face blank, the weight of what she had done still not fully hitting her. In the interrogation room, there were no theatrics, no outbursts. Just a woman who had made a choice she could never undo. The trial that followed was highly publicized, a media frenzy. Claire's defense team argued that she had been overwhelmed by emotion, that the years of neglect in her marriage, the betrayal by Thomas, had pushed her to commit an unthinkable act. They claimed it was a crime of passion, fueled by heartbreak and jealousy. But the prosecution was relentless, painting Claire as a woman who had crossed the line from lover to murderer. They spoke of her obsession, her manipulation, and the cold way in which she had ended Thomas's life. In the end, Claire was convicted of second-degree murder, her emotions and anger ultimately leading to her downfall. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The tragedy of the affair, the lies, and the violence was now a permanent part of her story, a story that had once been filled with hope and dreams of a better future. As for Thomas's family, their lives were shattered. Marianne, who had lost both her husband and her trust in people, struggled to rebuild her life, forever haunted by the betrayal that had unfolded in her own home. And Noah, Claire's son, was left to try and understand why his mother had made the choices she did. The life they had worked so hard to build together was now irreparably changed, their futures uncertain. The case of Claire Holloway and Thomas Sinclair became one of LA's most talked-about scandals, a chilling reminder of how love, jealousy, and obsession can lead to devastating consequences. The affair that had begun as a secret, passionate escape had ended in death, destruction, and irreversible loss for everyone involved. In this tale, the tale of hate and love, the Princess Claire faces her trial with a large past of suffering and irreversible loss for everyone involved.